Hello, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to ST Connect. This is a webinar series organized by the Straits Times. I'm Bhagyashree Garekar, ST's foreign editor, and your host and moderator. Today we have a very happening topic and a great panel for you. We're discussing what's next for Malaysia after it installed its third Prime Minister in 3 years. The latest change of government, less than 2 weeks ago, comes in the middle of a pandemic that's not showing any signs of winding down. Malaysia has been reporting around 20,000 cases daily. Prime Minister Ismail Sabri himself went into a quarantine this week, even as his cabinet was being sworn in. Public anger with the way the pandemic has been handled has grown, and alongside, growth projections for Malaysia have slipped. These are no doubt difficult circumstances for Prime Minister Ismail Sabri, and his next steps will be keenly watched in Malaysia and abroad. We have a great panel joining in from KL to discuss all these issues, but before we get there, let me take a few seconds to share some housekeeping matters. So first of all, this session will last for about an hour. Some of you have sent us your questions in advance, thank you, and we will try to answer them. And for the others on this call, you can still send us your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon on your Zoom screen. A recording of this session will be available on our website later today. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. Mr. Ibrahim Sufyan, Malaysia's most famous pollster. Ben Sufyan, as he's popularly called, is the founder and executive director of the Merdeka Center for Opinion Research in Kuala Lumpur. And I dare say that if you have followed the coverage of the last few Malaysian elections, you will have come across his polls. He is a sharp political observer, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts. And of course, we have our Malaysia Bureau Chief, Shannon Teoh. I'm sure he's a familiar figure to all our ST readers. Now, Shannon is also a nifty PowerPoint man, and today he has a treat for you. He'll be walking you through the political landscape, how we got here and what may follow. And after Shannon, Ben comes in with some significant numbers that he wants to share with us today. So turning to Shannon first. Shannon, the stage is yours.
So as she mentioned, I do have a presentation, so if we can have the slides up right now. Great, all right. So, hi everyone. It seems only yesterday that Malaysia recorded its first ever change of government at the historic 2018 election. But as some might say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. What's changed is that BN is no longer the outright government ruling on its own with its own majority. And what's changed is that somehow today, Anwar Ibrahim, the opposition leader who's been fighting with UMNO for 20 years, is now in cahoots with his supposed nemesis, people who are in UMNO. What hasn't changed? Well, just like before May 2018, the Prime Minister is still from UMNO now, again. Just like before May 2018, and in fact, all the way back to 1998, Anwar is still the opposition's Prime Minister in waiting. He's come very close several times, and he's still not managed to get to the premiership. So if you look at my title here for today, it's a reference to how the king has played a role in the intrigue over the last 18 months, but also to that professional wrestling event. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, where dozens of competitors jump into the ring and the goal is to be the last man standing. And the way Malaysian politics has gone on since the last election in the past 3 years, it's probably just as difficult to keep up with all the different contenders jumping into the ring. And I'll be honest with you, if you had told me even 2 years ago, back in 2019, Dato Sri Ismail Sabri Yaakob will be the next Prime Minister before the next election happens, I would have laughed at your face. But here he is the Prime Minister, the third Prime Minister we've had in just the past 18 months. So if you haven't been paying attention this past month or so, if you're living under a rock, this panel here that I have, this cartoon panel, who is by a popular independent comic artist in Malaysia, would kind of bring you up to speed. It would explain things. You can check out his Facebook, his Instagram for more. But basically where we are now is that Anwar and UMNO have worked together. They've succeeded in toppling Muhyiddin Yassin last month. And then making him the shortest lived prime minister. He lasted about 17 months and a few days. But still, despite leading the biggest coalition in Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, he leads Pakatan Harapan. They've got 88 MPs in parliament, which has 220 seats altogether right now, 220 members in the 222 seat chamber. Anwar couldn't claim a simple majority in parliament. I mean, he's got the biggest coalition, he still couldn't do it. Now, question is why, right? I mean, here we are, where for UMNO, I think we've come to realize that for them, the enemy of my enemy is still my enemy, right? It may work with enemies to defeat another enemy, work with one foe to defeat another foe, but they will never really help you to be more powerful than them. So they work with Muhyiddin to get rid of a Pakatan Harapan government, but because they played second fiddle to Muhyiddin, then they work with Pakatan Harapan to get rid of Muhyiddin. And now they're finally back on top. So in one sense, Anwar and Muhyiddin are not so different after all. They both wanted to be prime minister after Mahathir's return, and they both got played out by UMNO. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. I mean, let's move on to the second slide. If you look at how this horseshoe diagram of how parliament stacks up, it's a really messy status quo. Did you know that there are this many parties in Malaysia? Up to recently, I had no idea what some of these parties were. But if you look at the graphic and you say you close the legend here and you just look at the horseshoe, probably makes no sense. And you couldn't tell whether the blue of BN or the red of Pakatan Harapan is in power. It's very hard to tell. But it is Barisan Nasional in power right now. And if you count up all the different constituents, if you look at this legend, they have a slight majority now, 114 out of 220. And 2 seats are vacant because, no by-elections since the emergency was called earlier this year. Now you notice one in dark blue on the opposition side, and that's Tengku Razali Hamzah, UMNO's longest serving lawmaker. Now he's from Gua Musang, and he wanted to replace Muhyiddin himself, and he was the only one who was not happy that UMNO the party decided to go and back their vice president Ismail Sabri. So how did we get to this messy point in Malaysian politics? With an unstable government, a split ruling party, and about half a dozen prime minister candidates just waiting to take the highest office after an election due by 2023. Can I get to the next slide, please? So a bit of a history lesson. This is, I don't really have to explain everything that happened here, but Pakatan Harapan took power 2018. There was a succession plan where Anwar was supposed to take over midterm, but nobody would say exactly when. Mahathir himself would say 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. The goalpost kept shifting. But there were Mahathir supporters who basically didn't want Anwar to take over, Part of this was that they had this anxiety that Malay voters would not be impressed at Pakatan Harapan pushing out Mahathir in favor of Anwar. A lot of Malay voters in Malaysia, they respect the elder statesman, but they have their doubts about Anwar Ibrahim. Opposition parties at that time, like UMNO, PAS, these Malay Muslim parties, they stirred up a lot of racial and religious rhetoric against Pakatan Harapan, saying that they were undermining Malay interests and being puppets of the largest party in Pakatan Harapan, which is the Chinese-dominated and secularist DAP. Eventually, there was enough backing from all these parties that lost in 2018, along with some defectors from Mahathir's Bersatu and even Anwar's own PKR, to topple the government. So I won't go so much into detail about what happened. It was a very messy period, the Sheraton move. And I think we've spoken about this sort of things in other forums. But basically what we ended up was with a government that had 20 MPs that were part of the winning team in 2018, but 90 odd MPs were part of the losing team in 2018. That's the shape of the Muhyiddin government that took power last year. And in that government, Ismail Sabri, who was just a vice president, was given a pretty senior position. He was made a defense minister, and that was pretty much the genesis of his elevation over the past 18 months. We move to the next slide. So UMNO, of course, found the idea of being in government but not being in control very strange. So it still sees itself as the master and commander of Malaysia. This is its birthright, right? UMNO sees itself as Malaysia is mine to control. So it starts talking to Anwar, and this is specifically people that we say are in the court cluster, those with corruption charges. We know like Najib, like the president Zahid Hamidi, Secretary General Ahmad Maslan, and so on and so forth. Now, then Anwar claims it's now a widely mocked statement that he had a strong, formidable, and convincing majority in September, but the king is not convinced. Muhyiddin at that time decides that the safest thing is to go and ask for emergency and to get kind of immunity. King declines also, but the king then uses his kind of soft power to tell lawmakers, look, you have to pass the budget next month because without the money, we can't fight COVID, right? We need it. So all the lawmakers basically, accede to that, especially those in UMNO who were against Muhyiddin, and they passed the budget. But there's nothing stopping lawmakers after the budget is passed to go and then withdraw support from Muhyiddin. That happens in January. And this time the king steps in and gives him the emergency. So Muhyiddin couldn't be toppled all the way up to August. And guess what? In August, immediately more UMNO MPs pull support for him. And that pretty much takes us to the next slide here, where, Muhyiddin had to go back to his old friends in Pakatan Harapan, offer them some reforms and say, look, come and support me, I'll give you this reform. So now he's suddenly trying to move back towards forming this kind of me plus Pakatan government again. It's kind of winding the clock back by 18 months. But Pakatan didn't want the deal. Why? Look, Anwar, of course, felt that, well, if Muhyiddin's lost his majority, I could become prime minister finally, right? So even though he finally got the support of all 105 opposition MPs, there's 88 from Pakatan Harapan and 17 others from various other parties. He couldn't get any more from the ruling parties, especially from UMNO. He just needed 6 more. But even though 15 UMNO MPs had rejected Muhyiddin, none of them wanted to join Anwar. Instead, the UMNO MPs, as we know now, they rallied around Ismail Sabri, who himself led 24 UMNO MPs who insisted on staying in government. They didn't want to full support for government. So this means that despite a very deep split in UMNO, the UMNO leaders in the court cluster, right, that we talked about, preferred to support a rival in the party rather than Anwar and Ibrahim. But Anwar and Ibrahim were probably given them the sun, moon, stars, whatever they wanted for their support, but that still didn't work out. So now we have Ismail Sabri presiding over a government with the exact same makeup as Muhyiddin's. Same parties, same MPs, pretty much 90% of the same cabinet. Now, how did we get here? One former senior diplomat to Malaysia, put it to me, and I think it's quite a good way of putting it. There's no way the Malay establishment in Malaysia, and for which UMNO is still kind of the closest political mirror for, right? They pretty much in a closed feedback loop, will hand Anwar the premiership on the plate. They won't make him prime minister just like that. We're talking about the monarchy here, the civil service, things that, people have called like the deep state of Malaysia. So where this leaves Anwar is that he has to win it outright in an election. All this plotting to take power, has been a waste of time. But if it has been a strategy to divide his opponents, to divide the ruling parties, to divide Bersatu and UMNO and PAS, then it's worked out well. And we recently ran an analysis arguing that PH is not in great shape, but it's better placed today than it was 18 months ago. And some people don't agree with this analysis, but I think 18 months ago, they were in really bad shape. I think Ben can show you some polling data to show you that PH was really unpopular back then. Maybe we move to the next slide. And I just want to make the point here about, I'm stealing some content from Ben here. This is from Merdeka Center. I just want to illustrate this point that across Muhyiddin's prime ministership, his approval kind of ebbed and flowed in correlation to the COVID situation, because of and also as well the perception that the government was wasting resources politicking rather than fighting the pandemic. You can see here when Malaysia kind of entered a recovery MCO, that's when a lot of restrictions were loosened. His approval kind of went up a bit. When they had the Sabah state election, when they were seen as politicking and causing a new wave to happen, the approval went down. And I'm just overlaying here kind of the number of the caseload, right, in Malaysia. And every time you see a spike in the caseload, Muhyiddin's approval kind of drops. So you can see the two things are very correlated. So for Anwar, really, the chances at the next election for Pakatan Harapan, it really depends on how long people's memories are. If people remember the misery they've suffered for nearly a year now since restrictions were reinstated, then the ruling parties are in trouble, but how soon could elections be held, right? If elections are held in 2023, things might be fine by then. People might forget the misery that they had through 2020 and 2021. Well, if you look at the next slide, which will show you pretty much vaccination rate of share of population vaccinated. Now Malaysia has really been climbing up very quickly now. Nearly half of people, half of all Malaysians have double vaccinations. So many people are saying that by next year there could be elections, but I don't see a good reason for Ismail Sabri not to go to a full term, right? Unless he's really forced into a corner. What could happen? Maybe the same COP cluster, they found themselves underrepresented in this cabinet again. If they're unhappy, they could pull the plug one more time. But I think we will see a pause rather than a change of government this time, because based on those vaccination numbers, I think Malaysia would be ready to head to an election pretty soon. So as you can see, even though new cases are still about 20,000, the data we have from MOH says that about 98% don't suffer any serious symptoms. So if you want a kind of comparison, at the beginning of June, when Malaysia's vaccination, as you can see, less than 10%, more than 1% of active cases required ICU care. Today, as we're nearing 50% immunity, that's down to 0.4%. So very much fewer as a proportion of cases, much fewer people need ICU care. So with that, I just want to move to my last slide. I think I'm kind of running out of time. So at this point, if you've been following what's been happening in Malaysia this past couple of years, some might say that the main source, or maybe even the only source of political instability is really UMNO. And that's pretty much the most simple and time-effective framework to monitor what's happening in Malaysia. If UMNO is moving around and being very restless, something is up, right? So there are still complexities when it comes to looking at what might happen for the next election. So Zahid Hamidi is the guy in dark blue, top right corner. He's the president now, and he's backed by Najib. But his problem, of course, is that the graft charges, right? So when it comes to an election, the general election, he can't really present himself as a prime minister candidate because he's tarnished. And in fact, a guilty verdict would mean that he's disqualified from contesting. Below him is Muhammad Hassan, or Tokmat, as people call him. So he's the deputy president. And in this whole internal tussle that's been going on in UMNO, he's kind of galloped to the front as a kind of dark horse. He stood with the party president. And so he probably believes that his best path to maybe becoming the prime minister or rising to the top of the political ladder is to align himself with the party hierarchy, because he knows Zahid's out, Najib's out, they can't go and become PM candidate. So maybe he gets a chance. He can be their proxy, right? Because on the other hand, with Ismail Sabri at bottom left, he is now prime minister. He will probably want to stay as prime minister. So if you align yourself with Ismail Sabri, you're not going to be the top candidate. Things are further complicated because if Ismail Sabri now is in government, also largely with the support of Muhyiddin, whose coalition, Perikatan Nasional, has about 50-55 MPs, including independents, who are aligned with Muhyiddin. Muhyiddin has not ruled out a comeback. Instead, he said that I may come back, right? So at the next election, what happens? Does Bersatu and PAS back Ismail Sabri, or do they back Muhyiddin? It's a very messy game now going to the next general election. And as I mentioned, there's probably about half a dozen people who think that I could become prime minister after this election. So this is a story that could run for years to come. I mean, even after the election, we're not sure if we're going to have a very solid, a very stable government or ruling coalition. The kind of horse trading that we might see could be as messy or even more messy than the situation we find ourselves in right now. So watch this space. I mean, that's what I say to people about Malaysia. So that's all I have. Sorry to take up a bit too much time here, but back to you, Bhagya.
So thanks, Shannon. I think that was a great potted history of the last 3 years. And now if we can turn to Ben Sufyan to share what his polling has to show to us. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Bhagya, and thanks, ST, for hosting and organizing this webinar. I think it's timely to have a stock take in terms of what's going on in Malaysia, and to explore the questions that many of our viewers here have about what goes on in the country, what does it hold in store for Malaysians as well as neighbors surrounding us. So I have a short deck of presentations. Can we bring it up, please? Right, so what I have here is a collection of some slides that captures data from just before the termination of Muhyiddin Yassin's prime ministership. The new survey with the prime minister and the new prime minister is still underway, and what I can share with you are some of the highlights. Okay, let's go to the next slide. What are the key takeaway points? I'd like to speak about what the key takeaway points are. Basically, if we look at the trajectory of the Perikatan National Government, the one which went out last month, it came in through, I think it was a controversial means, as I think Shannon spoke about, with the defection of some of its political parties and members of parliament to join with the opposition at that time and forming a new ruling coalition. But be that as it may, the Perikatan National Government or administration at this point in time had some early successes in the early part of last year, in part because when the first wave of COVID-19 hit us here in Malaysia, they tackled it very strongly. The case numbers were very low, and the aid dispensation, financial support for affected families and businesses took place in a relatively quick fashion and was substantial enough that assuaged many members of the Malaysian public that at least the government is looking out for them. But since the middle of, well, not say the middle, since September last year, in the wake of the Sabah state elections, all throughout the period, there's always politicking going on. And then it culminated in a state election in Sabah. And since the Sabah state election concluded at the end of September 2020, the case numbers crept up and has not really come down since. And so now we are looking at in excess of 20,000 cases a day. And the number of deaths, is also on the high numbers of 200, sometimes 300 each day. And so the casualty figure from COVID and the fallout from the economic impact on COVID due to the extended lockdowns, that I think has soured the mood of the public towards the administration and allowed the detractors of then Prime Minister Muhyiddin to target him as the person responsible for this. At the same time, the politicking has continued unabated. At that point in time, UMNO withdrew support from the Perikatan National Government, but some of its lawmakers remained. And so the period between the early part of this year and when it concluded in July recently was marked by unending political drama involving UMNO leadership in the party who's not in cabinet, the so-called court cluster, because many of them are embroiled in legal cases stemming from the Barisan Nasional days. That has created unease on the part of the public, and we can see that in the charts. At the same time, there is a bright spark in the sense that the vaccination rate introduced by the government, vaccination program has gone in very strongly, aggressively, so they are vaccinating upwards of 500,000 people each day, and vaccination rate has reached, I think, at least 50% of the population, and are fast catching up with the rest of the world, particularly Singapore, which has done 80%. So in all, we hope to see vaccinations of nearly all adult Malaysians be completed by the end of the year, and then hopefully the authorities will see to it that the vaccination is also extended to younger people, particularly those that are in school. But while all of this is going on, schools have shut down, businesses have shuttered themselves. There has been a marked decline in economic activity because of the lockdowns in most parts of the country, and that has affected the jobs market, the economic sentiment in the country. So I think what I want to say is that this change in leadership from Muhyiddin Yassin to Ismail Sabri, while in some ways unexpected, but at the same time, looking at how things have turned out relatively messily for him towards the end, offers a new opportunity for the new administration, which is essentially the same administration as before, with the exception of a few figures, for them to change the narrative. But it is a luxury that they don't have. Time is a luxury that the new prime minister doesn't have. And the public patience is really wearing thin. Can we go to the next slide? Here, what you can see is a general slide that shows the mood of Malaysians. The red line marks people who feel that the country headed in the wrong direction. The darker line, the black line, for people who feel that country is headed in the right direction. You can see that, if you look at the graph towards the right-hand side of the graph, this graph begins from the moment Pakatan Harapan took over, which is on the far left side of the graph. It started on a very high footing, very high expectations of Pakatan Harapan, which it quickly dissipated, over time, due to many reasons that we can debate. It's perhaps due to unmet promises, dissatisfaction with other issues. So you have of that. But now, as we head towards the end of the Muhyiddin administration, you can see that the negative line, people who feel the country is headed in the wrong direction, has expanded to nearly 2/3 of the population. And what really drives these sentiments? Can we go to the next slide, please? What really drives the negative sentiment is basically unhappiness with the leadership, politics of the country, and then only then followed by the economic concerns. So you can see that the instability because of the dissension within the ruling coalition at that point in time created a lot of problems. Will these problems end? Will this dissipate? We're not sure, because it's essentially the same administration. You have a situation where in the past it was UMNO agitating against Muhyiddin Yassin. We could see this whole episode repeat itself with Bersatu agitating against Ismail Sabri. We could potentially see that happen in the near future. Next slide, please. Like I said earlier, the economy is the main driver of public sentiments as well in Malaysia. It has been so for the past decade. And we can see that this is a very erratic chart. But for the most part of the Barisan Nasional era in 2014, 2015, people were unhappy about the economy. You have an economy that's that's running on two tracks. It's really great for people who are in the top 20 population, but really tough for middle class and lower income Malaysians. And there was a brief moment of respite when Pakatan Harapan won government, when Perikatan Nasional came into administration, but with the lockdowns and the prolonged pandemic effects, sentiments have turned negative again. So as of now, 64%. As of the end of July, 64% of Malaysians were unhappy with how the government managed the economy. And, along with the lockdown, there is this prospect of small businesses shutting down. And small businesses, employ half of the Malaysian workforce. And so they are a big engine for the economy, and they're not doing so well. So I think a lot is riding on the new administration to put in place strategies to assist small businesses and other businesses in Malaysia for them to stay afloat, to keep the jobs of many Malaysians. Next slide, please. So as I round up in terms of how people perceive the performance of the government, Pakatan Harapan, like I said earlier, started very positively, and then somewhere towards the final third of its final trimester of its term, it turned negative. And in part, it's because of an accumulation of political mobilization on the part of its competition, and then unhappiness over some of its deliverables, and finally, its inability to address the needs, expectations, and also the psychological needs of the Malay electorate. Because, beyond just winning the election, I think one has to realize that Pakatan Harapan won the 2018 election with just a tiny sliver of Malay support, about 23%. That was it. But it was enough because the Malay votes were split three ways for Pakatan Harapan to win, because they had huge support from the non-Bumiputra community here in Malaysia. So as the majority population turned against them, first they coalesced. The PAS supporters and the UMNO or Barisan Nasional supporters joined forces. We saw huge rallies in 2019, in 2020, in support of measures against Pakatan Harapan. That deeply caused unpopularity. And the austerity measures introduced by Pakatan Harapan also didn't go well with the Malaysian public that was still, having a tough time dealing with making ends meet. That turned things south. Perikatan Nasional, when Muhyiddin took over, handed itself in a better position, in part because it had the support of the majority Malay Muslim Bumiputra community, both in Peninsular Malaysia as well as in Sabah and Sarawak. But these things went down. As case numbers went up, lockdowns intensified, economic activities petered out, then sentiments went down. So hence we have a situation before the government fell, before Muhyiddin Yassin left office, the approval rating for the government was only 34%. So now I think it's up for Ismail Sabri to turn the things around, and he needs to get his act together very quickly. And I think that becomes the subject of our discussion today. Next slide, please. In terms of how the government has performed over the last couple of years, there are some areas where they've done well, in the sense that they were able to get financial aid to businesses and people relatively quickly, as I've mentioned earlier. At the same time, they were seen to be able to still maintain the perception of upholding the rule of law, although that, I think, is under stress right now. And by that, I mean ensuring that leaders who were charged with irregularities in the previous administration continue to see their cases being heard. Next, we have other indicators such as fighting corruption, suppressing the pandemic, addressing employment issues, and managing the economy, as we've seen earlier. So these are areas where the government is having a tough time. Next slide, please. In terms of managing the pandemic, they were doing quite well for the most part of 2020. In the first wave of COVID, the case numbers were very low, in the hundreds, and basically by the end of June, it went down to 0. But by September onwards, the case numbers crept up, and now it's already endemic. It's part of the community, and case numbers are very high. Although vaccinations seem to have worked in the hardest hit areas around Kuala Lumpur, we can see that the number of hospitalizations have dropped, indicative that the vaccination has, I think, helped a lot of people overcome the virus. In terms of fighting corruption, there's always been a very testy figure, ranging about low 40s and high 30% approval rate, but that has gone down as well. In part because in the recent months, we saw a number of high-profile cases that were dismissed by court. I think notably was one former minister had his corruption case, was acquitted from a corruption case just weeks before the resignation of Muhyiddin Yassin. Next slide, please. And I think this is my second last slide. In terms of government performance with respect to jobs is important. We see the headline unemployment figures put out by the Malaysian authorities at about 5% unemployment. But if we look deeper into the number, we probably have a higher youth unemployment. At the same time, there are many people who are not fully employed. They are probably working temporary jobs as gig workers, food delivery, parcel delivery, and things like that. A lot of people may have lost work and are now engaged in small-scale entrepreneurship, food stalls, such activities. This has created a deep and, I would say, pressing concern. 76% of the public, of voters actually, are unhappy with what the government is trying to do with respect to creating jobs. And this is indeed a tough situation. But in terms of helping those in need, a majority, 54%, still feel the government is trying to do its best to get financial aid to families that need so. So it's still in a positive territory, but we can see that it is a declining trend. And then finally, let me just conclude by saying that, can we go to the final slide, please? The new Prime Minister's position is barely better off than that of Muhyiddin Yassin. As I think Shannon showed in his slides, the numbers of parliamentarians that support the new government, the new leadership, is barely 114. So it's only a handful of people that he can rely on to deliver him a majority in the House. But he has a limited time frame, perhaps a couple of months at the most, and definitely not more than that, to change the narrative and stabilize the political environment. There was an interesting meeting between the leaders of the opposition and the Prime Minister recently, right after he was named. And the speculation was that there will be a confidence and supply agreement between the opposition to support the Prime Minister and that of critical government bills, perhaps in return for reforms in certain areas that the opposition is demanding. We hope that this thing carries through, because the country needs political stability to deal with the pandemic and also to rehabilitate the economy that has been, I think, wrought havoc by the pandemic. And the public patience is running thin. With case numbers continuing to be high, we are not likely to see the tail end of COVID anytime soon. The Delta variant is here. The vaccination, while strongly being pursued, covers only the adult population. So we have a big challenge ahead to change the narrative, but also to begin delivering the goods to the Malaysian public. Ultimately, I see elections may be the only way to resolve the political impasse, but the outcomes are very uncertain because the political configurations in Malaysia is very, very mixed right now. We are not sure whether the current coalition that's ruling the country will stick together or they will part ways when parliament is dissolved. And when parliament is dissolved, it's also uncertain. People are predicting perhaps sometime next year, early next year or the middle of next year, before the Prime Minister will have to take it back to the public to gain a fresh mandate. And that's my quick presentation on this. Back to you, Bhagia.
Yep, thank you, Ben. That was great, and we had great data from you. So let me have a couple of questions for you both, and then we will try and take in as many as we can from the audience. So starting with you, Ben, you've showed us some pretty stark figures, and you say that more than 60% of Malaysians approve of how the government has handled the pandemic, and as well as the economy. And then in July, you say nearly 2 in 3 Malaysians thought the country was headed in the wrong direction. Ben, will you hazard a guess as to what the August polls are going to say?
I think there will be a slight improvement in terms of public sentiments about the direction of the country. I think many people, particularly Malay and Muslim Bumiputra voters, will pin their hopes on the new Prime Minister to turn things around, in part because perhaps UMNO is not going to strongly agitate for against the new leadership because it's coming from them. People expect that the stability that will come, even if thin and momentary, might give a chance for the government to do some of the things that it sought to do but it wasn't able to do. So I suspect a small improvement in terms of the direction in the coming surveys. Right. But it depends on what they do with the mandate that they've got.
Right. And I think you also refer to public patience running thin with, the government and for the past few years. And now the challenge for the government, as you say, is it's challenging that narrative, right? So he has the same team more or less to work with. He has the same tools. Now, do you feel that there are some advantages despite that Prime Minister Ismail Sabri can start off with?
Certainly. I think, a lot of Malaysians still ascribe a lot of, I would say, wouldn't just say support, but a lot of trust in the political leadership. So he has, I think, won himself some time to deliver the goods. So I think in terms of shaping this narrative, it will not suffice for him to issue statements alone. He really needs to show the goods. I think on the part of vaccination, a lot of Malaysians, applaud the aggressive stance taken by the government so far. So the appointment of Khairi Jamaluddin as health minister, I think that's a step in the direction to put a young and dynamic person in charge of a critical part of the national recovery agenda. The other part where he needs to move very quickly is to come up with an economic agenda to assist businesses that have been very badly affected by the pandemic, employees, as well as self-employed Malaysians, there are many of them in the informal sector, for them to regain their footing and then to begin to rebuild their livelihoods. That's very critical. So there is very little time to articulate new plans, but instead he needs to put in place cash, lots of cash, to assist businesses to recapitalize and also for entrepreneurs to be able to begin trading again. So it's part and parcel of the economic recovery plan, and he needs to move very quickly on this.
Okay, thank you for that. Shannon, now could you help demystify, I think, which are the two sort of central mysteries of Malaysian politics? So first of all, why is UMNO still so influential? We just heard of their historic defeat in the 2018 elections. And my second question, I'm going to pose both together, is why isn't the opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who heads the biggest coalition in parliament, as your pie chart showed, why can he not put together a majority of MPs and form a government?
So I think the two issues are kind of intertwined, right? They have a related kind of a basis for it. You have to look at UMNO not just as a political party that ebbs and flows according to how strong it is. UMNO's history is entrenched practically into the fabric, into Malaysia's nationhood, right? So at the last election, what happened? What happened was there were a lot of UMNO families. Now, it's dynastic, right? People support particular parties. I'm a lifelong supporter. My family's been a lifelong supporter. My father, my grandfather, have voted for UMNO. That's a kind of dynamic that you have in Malaysia. What happened in the last election? I mean, even from the ground, UMNO people were telling us, I usually campaign down this street, and all the shops during an election period, they would have UMNO flags. And this time they didn't. I know every single person in this family, they've all been UMNO supporters. I'm not sure what's going on this time. So it was a protest vote, right? People were not happy with the UMNO leadership at that time. It was led by Najib, and he was burdened by the 1MDB saga, and also he had introduced this GST tax, which was very unpopular. People blamed it for rising prices and inflation, things like that. So nonetheless, even though people voted against UMNO, they are still UMNO people, right? And the party remains influential because it seemed to speak on behalf of all these people, so many families, so many Malay families, the majority electorate in Malaysia. So even though they were defeated, right, this party is bigger than any particular individual in the party. It was bigger than Najib, it's bigger than Zahid Hamidi now. So when Zahid Hamidi or the party speaks and says on an issue which is close to the heart of Malays will look at it as UMNO saying this about this particular issue, and they will pay attention. But on their own, when they discuss Zahid Hamidi on his own, or Najib Razak on his own, or any other politician, they will say, this politician is lousy, he's just like the rest of it. But when you talk about UMNO has a sacred place in the Malay psyche in Malaysia. So it is still influential. When it talked about how the Pakatan government was, its claims, right, that Pakatan Harapan government was undermining Malay interests and trying to tear down all the privileges and special rights that Malays and Muslims enjoy, people listen. Even though they might not think much of the UMNO leadership at this point, people still listen. So a lot of this pressure came on Pakatan Harapan and eventually played a part in its collapse in 2020. And this is linked to why Anwar Ibrahim, he leads Pakatan Harapan. He's got 88 MPs, it's the biggest in Malaysia now. He can't put together the MPs to form government because if you were an UMNO MP right now, even PAS, right, which is the Islamic party, you wouldn't prop up an Anwar government because it would hurt you with your electorate. You've been saying all these things about Anwar, about Pakatan Harapan being anti-Malay, especially DAP, the biggest party in Pakatan Harapan. You can't then go and prop up this government. It would be suicide with your own constituents. There's also another added element. People were saying that, he just needs 6 more. In Sarawak, where it's not a Malay Muslim electorate there, there are Sarawakian Bumiputras. Can't he get MPs from there? But the establishment in Sarawak also do not favor Anwar. Now, why, right? Because they look at Anwar Ibrahim as also as representing things that they don't want in Sarawak. Now, at a very basic level, this just means that Anwar leads PKR and his partner DAP, which are also present in Sarawak. So they are political rivals in the state, whereas UMNO is not present in Sarawak. If you ask the Sarawak ruling parties, they would prefer to be with UMNO, who is not a rival in their state, than to be with Anwar, who is a rival in their state. So these are some of the complexities. When you look into it, it actually makes a lot of sense. Why 114 MPs now might not get along with each other, but at the very bare basic, we are not going to support Anwar. That's the basic stance.
Right, thanks. And now we're moving on to the next segment with our audience questions. And here we have a question that perhaps, Shannon, you can take up. What are the chances of seeing younger ministers with new ideas charting a new course for Malaysia without race-based politics?
tough, right? I mean, race-based politics is something that a lot of politicians try to say that we are trying to move on from, and we need to talk about needs-based, and we need to be even the new prime minister is talking about keluarga Malaysia, right? But just a few months ago, even last year, he was talking about how we should outlaw Chinese education groups. A few years ago, he said he accused Chinese businessmen of trying to corner the electronics market, and he tried to help Malay businessmen have their own digital malls, things like that, right? So this kind of racial rhetoric is people, yes, I believe a lot of politicians feel like if we can get past it, we would, but it's just such a powerful weapon that has been used in the past, and today it's become such a huge monster, right? I don't know if anyone can actually control it. It's basically the story of Frankenstein, right? Even if you have younger politicians coming in, does this necessarily change that dynamic? You can be younger, but the electorate is the same. The electorate might prefer younger leaders because they're sick and tired of the same old guys being there with their old ideas. But this is the electorate less racially minded? That's a really tough question to answer, because based on the evidence that we have, you can profile, you can actually figure out who's going to support which party just based on their race. 9 times out of 10 you'll be right, because the DAP or the MCA couldn't win in a Malay heartland seat, and UMNO will find it difficult in the middle of KL, where there are a lot of the seats where there are a lot of Chinese supporters. So you can't run away from there. As much as I think people would like to, there is centrally in how people think about their interests in Malaysia, there is a very strong racial element to it.
Right. And Shannon, here's a question from Mr. Stanley Pang, Singapore. And he wants to know, what's the likelihood of seeing a legislation against what he calls political frogs? Basically, he's talking of an anti-hopping or anti-defection legislation. Do you see that happening?
So that's for me as well.
Yes, please.
I think the government right now and the opposition, as Ben mentioned, they had a little chat about potential reforms and a confidence and supply agreement. The anti-hopping law is one of those elements in there, but it is an issue that is fraught with many many obstacles. One is that constitutionally, people have the freedom of association. So if you want to force people to stay within that party, once you've been elected, you have to stay within that party for the next 5 years. And if you decide to leave, there's A, B, C, D punishments. Either you lose your seat or you have to pay a fine, whatever is the law that they're going to put in place. You would have to amend the constitution for that to take effect. And that requires a 2/3 majority. So that is what the legal obstacle. Secondly, it's that party hopping is just, it sounds bad, right? Everyone says, you're a frog and so on and so forth, but it's part and parcel of the Westminster the democratic system, right? If you disagree with what your party is doing, you want to leave. If at some point, if you were a PKR MP and you disagree with what Anwar Ibrahim was doing, would you be forced to stay for the rest of the term? So these are also, on the one hand, yes, it's very bad if people are jumping and hopping parties for their own personal self-interest. But on the other hand, should politicians be bound just by their party stance when they themselves don't agree to it? If the party stance have changed since the last election, if at the last election my party supported this thing, but now you support something else, I don't stand for that. So can I leave? I mean, so they will have to figure out this law, and it's not a very simple process. It is very convoluted.
Ben, can I tap on you for the next question, which comes to us from Ambassador Zainul Abidin Rashid, Singapore. He wants to know, how can Malaysia best ensure credible regeneration of leadership at both party and national level?
I think the key element in getting better representation and better talent, better political talent in the country has to do with the party structure itself. In the context of Malaysia, I think the party structure at play, both parties in the ruling coalition as well as those in the opposition, in some ways they have calcified, in the sense that many people who have become senior leaders of the party have used their position to remain in place for decades. And they have blocked the entrance of younger people, maybe people with new ideas, from taking a stronger position in the party. And we do know that in all of these parties, there are structures in place to allow for selection and elections within the party context. But in many times, uh, it is biased or done in favor of incumbents. So because as the party grows older and larger, it has more members, new people coming in will need to have the resources to persuade, to influence other party members to support them. And typically one can only do so when one has the material wealth or the material ability to uh, gain the support of various members. So we can see that UMNO has changed its voting system from just 3,000 delegates to 140,000 over delegates, because the elections have been made broader. On the surface of it, it has democratized leadership selection, but at the same time, it has made it much more difficult for younger people to gain access to the membership, because you need more resources now to campaign in the party. So I think it's part and parcel of the democratic system. If parties were to make leadership selection easier, online means and things like that, I think you will get more people on board. At the same time, when they select candidates to run for office, either at a state constituency or to become a parliamentarian, rather than just start from a short list of a few individuals, perhaps more people to be considered as candidates, and these candidates will need to have a primary of some sorts within the constituency itself for them to be selected and chosen as a candidate for the political party. This is somewhat akin to the processes within, say, the Taiwanese political parties, perhaps. That could be a way to gain better talent and better representation for political parties in Malaysia.
I hope your suggestions are heeded, Ben. For the next question, it's for Shannon, and it comes from Mr. Mohammed Hafiz. He wants to know, why is there a reluctance to let younger ministers like Khairi or Hishamuddin or Azmin lead the government?
Well, I mean, we are stretching the definition of young here a bit when we include Hishamuddin and Azmin, I suppose. Even Khairi is in his mid 40s or late 40s, if I recall.
I must say they
properly.
look very
But I get
youthful.
the spirit of the question, because our prime ministers have been 95 years old, 70-something years old, and so on and so forth. And to kind of let the next generation lead. And I think Ben already touched on this point, because the stalwarts, right, the veterans, the guys who have been in the party for so many decades and building up their networks, they're entrenched, right? It's so hard to displace them. So I think the reluctance here is just built on a politician's self-interest, right? You want to, how many people have been prime minister in Malaysia? Up to 2018, there was only 6, and suddenly now we have 9. But a lot of people, obviously, you want to be prime minister. There's nothing wrong with that. You're a politician, you should be ambitious. But so few people have had the opportunities to rise to the top of the political game. And so they stay there hoping that this time it's my chance. The next time it's my chance. The next time it's my chance, and so on and so forth. And then that kind of creates this bottleneck for the people that are below or lower down in the hierarchy. Now, I think that one of the reforms that are kind of being put in place, being discussed rather between the government and the opposition now, is to limit a prime minister's terms, maximum of 2 terms. Again, the mechanics are difficult and convoluted about how you're going to assure that. But if you do have a mechanic like that, then you ensure that there is a rejuvenation, right, at the very top level of government. Prime Minister stays for 2 terms and is out. You have to groom the next Prime Minister and the next Prime Minister and the next Prime Minister. This is on the very general level. What might have been the cause of people trying to stay around for so long waiting for their chance? Well, we had one Prime Minister who stayed for 22 years, from 1981 to 2003. And in that time, he got rid of, I think, quite a handful of deputy prime ministers, people who supposedly he was grooming to replace him, but then was not satisfied with them and got rid of them, got them replaced. He faced party challenges from his would-be successors. He defeated them. They spent time in the wilderness, so on and so forth. So a lot of people, a lot of talent also were dropped in that time, and they didn't get a chance. And their followers also didn't get a chance. And this particular team, Mahathir's team, got more and more entrenched. And you kind of saw this talent gap. And that's something that we are now, we are reaping the harvest of what he sowed, right, back then. But it's not all doom and gloom. I think there is a push from younger Malaysians to see their peers in decision-making positions. So we have people like Syed Saddiq, right? He's not even turned 30 yet. He started a new party. He said, I've had enough of this old politics. I'm starting a new party. It's not only for the young, but it is going to give the young a voice. And this is a very serious effort. It's got hundreds of thousands of members, if I've checked properly. And that's very significant just for a party out of nowhere. They've just started maybe a year, 2 years ago. So it is something to watch. We're not sure if they can make an impact at this coming elections, but certainly Syed Saddiq is young. He's got about 3-4 election terms before he's even as young as Khairi, to put it in that sense. So this could be the start of something that might change the dynamics with regards of age in Malaysian politics.
Right, and I'm afraid this will have to be a last question because we're running out of time, but a quick one, and if I could get a quick answer from you, Shannon. It's from Yo Kiat Boon, and he wants to know, besides the king, are there other hidden hands influencing and affecting the political direction of Malaysia?
I hesitate to refer to the king as a hidden hand. That's not something we say in Malaysia. But if we're talking about political actors who are not politicians themselves, yes, I mean it's not just Malaysia. Many countries, there are influential generals. For example, if you look at Thailand, military is strong there. You look at Myanmar, military is strong there. That's not the case in Malaysia. I think the military in Malaysia pretty much hands off. But other institutions like the police, the judiciary, their independence or neutrality has been called into question several times. There's nothing conclusive here to say that this particular judge prefers this politician or this policeman prefers. But these accusations and this kind of speculation has always been there. So this is what, in my presentation, I referred to as the deep state, right? There's been this conversation about the deep state. Is there not necessarily like a cabal of secret hidden hands, like the Illuminati or things like that. But generally, there is people of influence in Malaysia in certain positions of authority who prefer things to go to a certain way. It would be in their interest. So this is, I don't think, unique to Malaysia, a kind of capture of political resources of interest by a certain group of elites. That's pretty common. And yes, there is in Malaysia as well, but it's not a case of this person specifically trying to make things happen this way. It's not the Da Vinci Code, right? I mean, it's more about the structure of how influence and political resources work in Malaysia.
Okay, thank you. And we have to kind of head to a close now, but one quick question to both of you, and I just want a date or a year. Basically, both of you refer to elections. When do you see that happening? How soon do you see that happening? So Ben.
Well, I have two possible deadlines. I think if the situation in Malaysia continues to be, the political situation, continues to be very contested and challenging, then I think we might see elections take place sometime next year, perhaps at the end of the second quarter of next year, we might potentially see elections. But if the situation is more stable, then I would imagine the new Prime Minister will want to use time to improve on his delivery, strengthen his base so that he can win the next election as well. So that might then take it closer to the full extent of the term, perhaps in early 2023, but that's just my speculation.
Right. And Shannon, to you, we just allow you one option. What's your best guess?
Only one option.
One.
My decision will be based on what the court cluster does, right? Najib, Zahid, and these guys. Do they want to back Ismail Sabri all the way, or would they decide that if Ismail Sabri doesn't help us and play nice with us, then we are going to pull support for him? So actually, the Prime Minister here has all the cards in his hand is to decide what he wants to play with. I am going to stick my neck out, since you've only given me one option, to say 2023. Also because I think I need a bit of a break, and so I don't want a general election next year.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim Sufyan of Merdeka Center, and Shannon Teoh, our Bureau Chief at KL, for joining us today. And thank you too to our audience for joining us again for this session. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Straits Times website later today. And if I could have a couple of minutes just to make an announcement that Shannon will be coming out very soon with a weekly newsletter that's going to give you his reading of the biggest developments in Malaysia. You can sign up for it. It's going to be a free newsletter, and we will be putting up the signing details on the ST website. And also, tomorrow, the Straits Times interviews the Malaysia's Finance Minister, Tengku Zafrul Aziz. And if you have a question for him, please send it to us before 7 p.m. tonight. And details for how to do that are in today's ST in print and on our website as well. So do avail of that opportunity if you like. So thank you everyone, stay informed, keep healthy and keep safe. Until next time.